Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Human School's Curation Corner, one part of our learning journey here at the Human School. I'm Randy.
I'm Rachel.
And I'm Chad. I'm so sorry. This is not our first time with this software, and I couldn't get it off mute fast enough.
That's okay. It's all part of the learning journey. So each episode, we engage in brief conversations that are focused on a specific resource. First, you'll hear us summarize the author's intent or their ideas, and then we'll make connections to our own experiences and finally share some insights and a couple additional questions that you can think about to further your learning. In this episode, we're chatting about a recent article titled, "America's Teachers Aren't Burned Out. We Are Demoralized" by David Stieber. If you're interested in the actual article, you can find a link below the video at thehuman.school. All right, to kick this off, what's the author saying? Probably the best way to say this is just to repeat the title. America's educators aren't burned out, we're demoralized. So what does this look like? And in the article, Stieber references a number of experiences from his own work as a teacher in the Chicago public schools. Some examples of what he shares, examples of being demoralized or feeling demoralized. Watching 7-year-olds on a school night in February plead with school officials to not close their school. Taping down broken asbestos tiles on the floor so students and staff don't breathe in a carcinogen. And a third one, supporting students who want to speak up and out, only to be told, excuse me, they're indoctrinating students who dare to challenge the status quo. So the author is a teacher in the Chicago public schools. He shares stories about actual experiences, and he also references the idea that many schools in America are under-resourced, and that leads to gross inequalities of opportunities across the system. And it's not teachers that are burned out. And he, quoting him, teachers care deeply about students and the profession, and they realize that school policies and conditions make it impossible for them to do what is good, right, and just. And there's another quote that I like that I think really captures his intention here, and that is, all of this is intentional on the part of our school systems and those controlling them. And it reminds me of the idea that the system was designed to be that way. It was designed to dehumanize. It was designed to make the people in it kind of feel trapped and disempowered, which I think is what he's communicating in his article. And what I really like about it is that this is a real practitioner voice in the classroom. But one of the concerns I have about the article is that it just kind of stops there, and that I wanted him to take some action, to actually find ways, despite all the inequities in the system that make him feel oppressed, that how could he begin to shift how he thinks about this work? And I think it connects to this idea of the mindsets and the things that we're talking about here. I really wanted to be empathetic to the situation, but I also wanted to see some light. And I don't know if I saw that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel this article in a lot of ways. I taught in a school like that outside of Philadelphia for my first couple of years in teaching. We had plexiglass windows that were broken, covered in chicken wire. We didn't have whiteboards. We had wood panels that were painted with whiteboard paint. Didn't have books. We had a curriculum that was online, but we only had 9 computers for our classes of kids. And the curriculum itself was wrong. So it was reading a bunch of slides in a row, and then there would be a 10-question quiz, except for the quiz, the things that it would mark the kids wrong on were correct, and the things that it marked as the right answer were wrong. And then, the whole host of outside issues too. guns and violence and gangs and poverty and all of that. So I have a lot of empathy in reading that because I lived that for a couple of years and I remember it well. And it formed a lot of my basis. I think, like you, though, I struggle on the other side of where it goes, the bright spot that you're asking for. I mean, part of me wants to say there isn't one because that area of education is such a disaster, from funding to regulation or overregulation to staffing to everything. It's such a huge, huge, huge disaster. But then the other part of me says, that can't be a solution to anything. And so I think one of the things that I would have loved to also see, like you said, was where we can act in the system as participants in it, but that also people who are outside of it. So, for example, I live in Philadelphia, and there was an article written a couple of years ago as Philadelphia started closing a bunch of their schools. One of the schools got turned into this event space. And part of it kind of plays on this idea of like being a bar that looks like it used to be a school. And the author talked about sort of the difficulty of that you're going and you're drinking at this place that is now a closed down school because they don't have funding for it. And how that's kind of like messy and icky, and asked for the younger age group, like, 30s, to advocate for that they have a lot of power in the system because they have money and they have voice and they are allowed for the things that they want, and gave a couple of examples of things that population had gotten changed in the city. And so the article asked that population to do the same about schooling and education and making sure that there's fair funding formulas, and something similar. So I think, to me, it would be that it's, yes, we want to be able to help ourselves, but also we need other people to help us too. And here's what that might look like. So I agree with you. I have a ton of empathy in that. But I agree that I would love something a little bit more than just, we need community-based schooling, because at least in our current system, even if you have a school board instead of the mayor that regulates it, like we have in some cities that have school boards, it doesn't fix the problem. The funding issue still exists. So, yeah.
I will kind of agree with both of you in the sense that, I have a significant amount of empathy for the conditions in which the teacher and the learners are currently working in. And, empathy doesn't get you very far. What you really need is action. So I want to be very clear that, this conversation's, it's a little uncomfortable because, we're, not in a great position in some respects, although we're trying to build some thinking around how to design a system in which these kinds of inequalities and inequities are addressed at the root area, because the focus is on the real human needs. So let me just start there. I'm going to be, for those of you who are wrestling fans, I'm going to take the kind of the heel turn here, and be a little bit of an objector and push. I think we've talked a little bit about this idea of the victim mentality or the victimhood, and feeling like there's a lack of agency within the system. And one of our mind shifts is really around this idea that leadership is a call to action for those who feel, for anyone within the system to feel compelled to act. And I want to be very clear that I am not implying that the author of this has not chosen to act. That is not my implication. I think the thing that I have noticed during the really difficult conditions of the pandemic is that there have been some very vocal educators on social media who have basically shared just how horrific the conditions are. And what's happened is we've gotten to this very generalized perspective about how awful education is everywhere. And I, again, want to be very clear that the conditions that have been in place are very challenging. They're unlike anything that anyone has ever experienced. People weren't prepared for. They could never have been prepared for. Like, those are all true. I am not here to say that they have not been a challenge. I do worry, though, that negativity about the profession leads to some challenges. Who would want to go into public education today based on the public outcry, but then also from the internal processes. And it feels to me at times that negativity that comes out of, out of our tweets or out of our, posts or whatever it looks like about the conditions inside the classrooms, they're not advocating for better circumstances. They oftentimes come across as, I'm going to use the word complaining. I have an educator friend or colleague who, is a very well-sourced resource district, has tons of support and structures, no doubt have had challenging conditions throughout the pandemic. But I would say that the percentage of negative tweets about what's happening in their classroom, they're amplifying the negativity and the challenges, but yet you're not seeing a whole lot of positivity. And what it leads you to believe is that the conditions on a daily basis are just absolutely miserable. And I would challenge whether or not they're as miserable as the one the author describes. This is not a school where their heat is not turning on, or there's asbestos coming from the ceiling, or they don't have access to technology or resources. And so I will say that I worry about the generalization. We've talked about standardization, and it seems that the narrative right now about public education, at least in the, the edusphere out in social media, has been that, the teaching profession is just this horrible place to be. And that doesn't diminish the challenges of the job. It's always been a difficult job, and it's even more challenging than it's ever been now. I'm not a practitioner in a classroom, so I'm sure some people are rolling their eyes at that. I want to honor and recognize that. But I'm not sure that we're helping ourselves when we don't take an advocacy stance. And I think that's the part that I maybe object to a little bit is, it's okay to verbalize the frustrations, but how do we turn that into action? And I think that's where for us, when we talk about these really tough conversations, is how do we shift people out of that place where you're passive and maybe you're kind of objecting, but you're not moving it into action. And for us, the mind shift is how do we move from this passive place into this more proactive approach?
And I wonder, too, if it's sort of the way that we frame leadership, and that we frame our leaders in a way that we think in those conditions they need to be saviors.
Yes.
So there needs to be somebody in the district or somebody in the school who is going to save us from all this list of things that are injustices and just bad. And I totally agree with that. But I think that we have to change the way that we frame leaders, and we need to own some of that. And I think that we frame leaders as saviors because it's kind of warm for us to think that. It kind of makes us feel good. Like, it's really not my responsibility. I don't have any stake in this game. So we'll just say that the old industrial hierarchy says there's somebody in a seat somewhere who's really responsible for this, and they're going to save me from this, or at least they should. And I think that, like you said, our mind shift is everyone's a leader. And I will say, I think one step that the author has taken is to actually write this article and put it out there. I think that's leadership. He's telling his story. He's trying to create a connection with people to see the conditions and to understand how he's feeling through this article. And I think that is a great action step. What would the world be like if every teacher, every educator, every school leader, every superintendent, every custodian, every bus driver wrote an article or told a story? Wouldn't that be awesome? And that's action. And what else? I guess that's what I would ask. That would be my question. And what else?
And I think the thing that I would also kind of articulate there is in the way that he makes the distinction between demoralization and burnout, which I think is a really critical distinction. Like, I think that was brilliant, and it was important for him to write that and to share it. I think the second component of that is I think about context, right? I alluded to that when I was sharing a little bit earlier, that I think we also have to avoid the overgeneralization and speak to the specific context in which, I think it's unfair to assume that his experience in Chicago is exactly the same as the school teachers in Philadelphia. The students are different. The culture is different. So it's not to say that there aren't similarities, but to Randy's point, when people feel that the first call to action or one of their calls to action is to share their story, it helps to make the context in which they're living and working in and serving in more real, because it's not this generalized belief about every teacher. We as teachers, educators, we hate when people generalize our work and the negative things that happen and that get put in the media. And yet I think we have to be careful that we're not also doing the same thing of overgeneralizing experiences because they are so different.
So I was in a training a couple of weeks ago, and there was a woman who was giving a presentation on on kind of redefining what self-care means and what that looks like. And she had this really lovely presentation that was really honest about her persona versus her reality. And then, she comes across as really peppy. She was an elementary teacher. She's kind of like rah-rah-ish and owns very quickly, like, I know that the perception of watching me is that my life must be like this. Here's my reality. And she had this great slide where she had 5 or 6 or 7 things of like, here are these really big life altering things that I'm dealing with that are really hard for me and that are not happy and smiley and rainbows and sunshine. Her whole thing was that we can help ourselves, but we have to stop believing that we have to make a 180-degree shift, that we can do it 2 degrees at a time. And that some of that is mind shift and mindset changes. And one of the things that she talked about was the first rule of whitewater rafting, which is be part of your own rescue. And that I think oftentimes when people hear these conversations, they think it's one or the other. I'm supposed to advocate for myself. I'm supposed to fix this whole thing. I'm one person. It's this whole system. What am I supposed to do? You have to fix it. The other person's like, I'm one person in this whole system. How am I supposed to do that? But I think when everybody starts pointing fingers in the other direction, nothing gets done. But if we're doing it together, that as a teacher, as an administrator, as a superintendent, as a politician, as a community member, as a parent, as a student, like if everybody starts doing the part that they can do to start changing things, that's when you see change start to really happen. And so as teachers, be angry, share your story, be frustrated. This whole situation for everybody in a bunch of different ways, and not just in education, has been really hard. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. But then what are we going to do about it? How can we help our students? How can we help each other? What are the things that we do have control over? What is our locus of control? How can we help the people in front of us not suffer in the same ways that we're suffering? How can we help the person next door not suffer in the same ways that we might be suffering? Or how can we alleviate some of that, as well as looking to the people above us or next to us and saying, I also need you to be part of this process too. I also need you to help kind of, like dump water out of the sinking boat or whatever it is that it feels like we're all on right now. And I think that is kind of the clarification of, it's not you have to help yourself, it's you have to help too. And we're going to help, you're going to help, the person next door is going to help. We're all going to kind of work together, because if we're just always waiting for someone to rescue us, it's never going to happen. But if we start trying to rescue ourselves and each other, then that's where some change starts to occur. So when we talk about taking action, I don't want people listening to this to feel like it's the you have to deal with it yourself conversation. Oh, well, if you're not going to do anything about it, I can't help you. It's not that. It's that we have to help ourselves too, not only. So yeah, that was kind of the only real clarification that I wanted to offer. Middle ground.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the things that you shared that I really appreciated is it's bravery and courageous to share that, right? And I find that when I'm in situations speaking with people and I have the courage to kind of share the way you shared the story about the person that you were with a couple of weeks ago, you find some common ground, right? I think sometimes there's this thing where I'm afraid to admit that I'm hurt, or I'm afraid to admit that I'm grieving, or I'm afraid to admit that I don't have great answers. And that willingness to just speak that truth can sometimes create a little bit of that momentum of like, okay, like we're both feeling the same thing. And that's one thing I would say to your point, Rachel, is if we can speak truth to maybe those things that help us to move forward, as opposed to just simply speak to the things that are holding us back, that might end up being a little bit better for not just ourselves, but for our kids as well.
So this has been a good conversation, going a little bit longer than we usually go, which is good because this has clearly been an article or a resource that's sparked some good conversation. And I'll just close out with, from our conversation, one of the insights that I'm coming up with inside my head right now is our secret weapon is really our humanity. And when we connect with other people and take action together as a community of two or more, we can really move the dial on some of this stuff. And it may seem like a lot of heavy lifting, but I think if we go back to our humanity, our relationships, our connection, we can really solve and make some progress on a lot of these ideas. So I think with this episode, we wanted to shift up the end a little bit here by leaving our listeners and viewers with some questions to think about. So I'll lead off with the question that I came up with. What is a first step to taking action, and how can you not be a victim of the system, but take ownership and control? Shall I read your questions, or did you each want to read yours?
I'll read mine.
Okay.
So, how might teachers take part in writing their own stories in the classroom? And then, moreover, how might teachers encourage students to also be part of writing their own stories as well?
And my question, how might we see ourselves as leaders and advocates in reimagining a new human-centered system within our schools?
All right. Love those questions, and really love chatting with both of you. I always end a conversation with some new insights and new learnings, and hopefully you do as well. And hopefully our listeners are finding the same thing. All right, to wrap it up, thanks again for learning alongside us on this episode of the Human Schools Curation Corner. You can join us in today's conversation at the Learning in Public Hub at thehuman.school or on our YouTube channel. The Human School, by placing humanity at the center of all design, the Human School seeks to share an evolving story of learning and its impact on the world. We can't wait to hear how you are intentionally placing humanity at the center. For additional resources, visit thehuman.school and the Learning in Public Hub and join a community committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. Thanks again, everyone. Until next time, see you later. Take care.